Invite my four panelists up onto the stage, and we'll give this a good old go over the next 45 minutes. I can see one of my panelists chuckling already, which is a good sign. So in no order at all except my memory, would Robert Gates, John Bolton, Newt Gingrich, and Paul Krugman all join me on the stage right now? And please give them all a very warm welcome. Welcome, all of you, and do feel free to choose whatever chair you desire. I must say, I'm very impressed with all of you. You're eating so quietly now. It's fantastic. So thank you very much for that. Let's get straight into this, because I think the more we can make it compelling, the more people will focus on us and not the food. Gentlemen, I'm not going to give you all grand introductions, but very briefly, John Bolton, many of you will know as a former US ambassador at the UN and long-time thinker on US foreign policy and international strategy. Newt Gingrich, whom I had the pleasure to talk to on this very stage a year ago. I think it's fair to say then, Newt, you were warm in your feelings toward Donald Trump, and let's see if you're quite as warm today. We'll get to that in a minute. Robert Gates, I've had the pleasure of interviewing on HARDtalk. He is a former US Defense Secretary, of course, and again, a man who has spent many, many years considering America's place in the world. And Paul Krugman, whom we've all just listened to, talking about what's new and not so new about the world economy right now. Thoroughly enjoyed that, Paul, and we now want your take on America's place in the world as well. So let me start with a general question, and I'll actually, if I may, I'll start with you, Robert Gates. To what extent do you think Donald Trump has challenged, is challenging, the fundamental tenets of US foreign policy? To what extent does he represent something dramatically different?
Well, I would draw a distinction between his actions and some of his rhetoric. I think his actions are generally in the broader framework of U.S. foreign policy. I think that he has proceeded in terms of actions with some care with respect to China. I think that he has, after a difficult start, gotten round to the right place with respect to NATO and our fealty to the alliance and to Article 5. I think that he has reluctantly, so far, generally followed the general contours of U.S. policy in the Middle East, clearly more favorably disposed toward the Arab Gulf states than President Obama, but I think still within the broad parameter. So I think that there are some areas where there is a very clear difference. One is on trade, and in particular, the Trans-Pacific Partnership and walking away from that. My own personal view is that that was a great gift to China that we need not have made. So there are some differences, I think, in terms of trade.
If I may interrupt for a sec, and forgive me for the rudeness, but you've chosen to give us a very useful sort of tour d'horizon of the world and what the US, since Trump came to power, is doing. But in a more fundamental and general sense, surely his message to the world is, to use his own slogans, America first, making America great again. It is a form of nationalism, both economic and strategic, which leaves partners around the world thinking, you know, what happened to America as, you know, a multilateral guarantor, a partner, a nation of values which would stick up for values right around the world?
Well, I think this goes back to my original point of the distinction between the rhetoric and the actions. It is absolutely true that when it comes to promotion of democracy, promotion of freedom and liberty around the world, the administration's been pretty quiet. On the other hand, an emphasis on U.S. interests is not at all unique to this presidency. And in fact, I would argue that most presidents have taken into account, above all, American interests. So you have, just historically, for example, you have the author of the Four Freedoms and the person who was responsible for the New Deal and human rights and political rights, FDR, allying with history, one of history's worst monsters, because we had a common enemy, because it was in our national interest. I would argue that every president, first and foremost, does what is in the national interest to protect the American people. I think that you were seeing this under Trump. What we haven't seen from this administration is the willingness in our rhetoric and in our public positions to defend liberty and to defend democracy and to support it. Have we dealt with authoritarian governments before? All through our history. So I think, again, we have to draw a distinction between actions and rhetoric.
Yeah, but that's problematic. When your message from the very get-go of this conversation has been, you know what, don't judge the leader of the free world by what he says, because, frankly, a lot of it can be discounted, but only judge the United States by actions, that creates problems, not least for friends, because you're sort of suggesting that when the president tweets, when the president says stuff, you've got to ignore it, because it may well not represent what America is going to do, and that leaves us all puzzled. And Newt Gingrich, I want to turn the question a little bit more personal. James Clapper, former director of US National Intelligence, says that this president should not be commander-in-chief. He is unfit, he is dangerous, and to paraphrase Clapper, he said, I hope he doesn't last 4 years. We cannot afford 4 years of this nightmare. Those words are listened to around the world, and there is a perception that Donald Trump could be dangerous for the world. What do you say to that?
Well, what can you say? I mean, Clapper's entitled to his view. That's a political statement by a former director of national intelligence who has his own view of life.
Well, that's kind of a big deal, isn't it? A former national intelligence director.
Not necessarily. Look, we have a deep divide culturally in the United States right now. The biggest shock in modern American politics was between 8 o'clock and 11 o'clock on election night. At 8 o'clock on election night, every liberal in America was happy. Hillary Clinton was going to win. They were going to break the glass ceiling. In fact, there's a wonderful book called Shattered by two young reporters who had sold their publisher that they would do the inside story of the first woman president, and by 11 o'clock that night figured they better sell a new version. And I think the left hasn't recovered to this day. I mean, if it had been Jeb Bush, they would have gone, all right, that's unfortunate. You know, if it had been John Kasich, they said, well, at least we can negotiate. It was Donald J. Trump. I mean, the idea that you could go from a guaranteed Clinton victory at 8 o'clock to Donald J. Trump at 11 o'clock at night affected people like Clapper in ways that I think are psychological. And they haven't recovered. I mean, they still wander around. They wake up in the morning, and he's on Fox and Friends, and he's on Morning Joe, and he tweets, and he reminds them. It drives them crazy.
Get to my point, though. Donald Trump is perceived around the world as somebody potentially dangerous. Take handling of...
He is potentially dangerous. So was Richard Nixon. So was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So was John F. Kennedy. You don't think the Cuban Missile Crisis was dangerous?
I think it was dangerous, and I think Kennedy, the history books suggest Kennedy handled it very well. So let's take North Korea today.
Well, I hope we can handle Korea as well as Kennedy did.
What Donald Trump has done with his fire and fury, unleashing of a power the like of which the people of the world have never seen, what Donald Trump has done is plant the idea that it is entirely conceivable that the United States might conduct a preemptive military strike to stop North Korea's nuclear weapons program. Now that's fine if he means it, but we don't know if he means it or not. So you try and unpick this for us.
First of all, and there are several people in here who know Jim Mattis better than I do, I don't think Secretary Mattis is wandering off to North Dakota to check out land-based ICBMs and then wandering off to the Strategic Command just for fun. I think we are trying to send a signal to North Korea, which has had, by the way, since 1994, Every American system since 1994 has tried to figure out a diplomatic way to convince the North Koreans not to do what they're doing. Now, they are now at a point where they're beginning to threaten to take out an American city. No American president could responsibly allow Kim Jong-un to have that capacity.
John Negroponte, whom I'm sure you know, told me just the other day, it is inconceivable that America is going to launch a preemptive military strike against North Korea, and therefore for Trump to suggest it in the way he is doing is irresponsible because it's going to weaken American credibility.
Well, let me suggest to you two things. And I happen to not favor a preemptive strike, although I have been advocating since 2007 a doctrine that says if we can't inspect your missile, we kill it on launch. Because I think the idea of tolerating a North Korean missile capable of reaching the United States with a potential nuclear weapon or hydrogen weapon and losing an American city because we are still negotiating and being reasonable is insane. And I think countries have the right to defend themselves. This is an extraordinarily dangerous country. But I would also say to you, we are suggesting to him, if we picked up signals, and you have several people in this room who've been in these meetings, if we picked up signals that they were seriously considering a launch against the United States, I have zero doubt we would preempt. We're not going to risk losing 2 or 3 or 5 American cities over the world opinion that, gee, it would be unfortunate for us to assume that a guy who's clearly, I don't think he's crazy, by the way, and I don't think he's irrational. I think he operates very cleverly off of a model we don't understand, but that makes perfect sense if you're a North Korean dictator.
Tempting though it is to spend a lot of time discussing North Korea just because it matters to us all, I want to keep this in terms of broader principles as well as specific policy challenges that Donald Trump is facing. So John Bolton, when you hear Angela Merkel, for example, saying, as she did, I think it was in May, that, and it was clearly directed at the United States, perhaps at Brexit as well, but she said, look, we in the European Union can no longer rely on our traditional partners. We have to take our fate into our own hands. She seemed to be indicating that she sees Donald Trump as a factor which is fundamentally changing transatlantic alliances. Do you see it that way?
No.
Would you care to expand?
Sure. You know, just speaking as a Fox News contributor, this is what's wrong with TV interviews, because your questions are so divorced from history that it's tempting to follow you down the primrose path of increasing cycles of rhetoric. I think you've got to come back to reality. And the reality is that Trump is a unique force in American politics. He can be distinguished from other presidents in recent history by 2 main factors. Number one, he's not a politician. So many Americans were not used to him, and certainly probably everybody in this room who's not an American isn't used to him either. That's one reason why he beat 16 Republican politicians for the nomination, and I didn't support him, but he defeated 16 Republicans, and then he defeated the worst possible Democratic nominee to win election. So he's not a typical politician. He won't behave as a typical politician. And I'm sorry to disappoint you, but you've got over 3 years of it to go. Number two, he doesn't care as much about policy as other American presidents have. That doesn't reflect my view, but it reflects his view. And it's, I think, significant because the only person in contemporary American history who resembles Donald Trump in any way was the Republican nominee in 1940, Wendell Willkie, and he lost. So we have no contemporary experience with this. But the notion that this anomaly at a time of enormous dissatisfaction among the American public at large with conventional politics is going to represent a dramatic break in foreign policy is just wrong. And I'll just give you one more example, if I may. The horror that Trump said America first. Let me just remind you of 2 things. Number one, in 2008, the Republican nominee for president, John McCain, whom I fully supported, had as the motto for his campaign, country first. Now, what country do you suppose he was talking about? Number one. Number two, During the Wilson administration, when he made his famous comments about making the world safe for democracy, Theodore Roosevelt, directly taking that point on, said, first, we are to make the world safe for ourselves. So just speaking as a Roosevelt Republican on national security matters, I think this is a direct line to peace through strength with Reagan and America First Now. Will it be implemented the same way with the same smooth style as, Theodore Roosevelt? Well, maybe not. But calm down, for God's sakes.
Do you care about the way the U.S. is currently perceived around the world? I mean, there was one Pew International poll that suggested across 37 countries that right now publics see Vladimir Putin as a guy who is more likely to behave responsibly on the international stage than Donald Trump. Do you care about that?
If I let international public opinion polls sway my views on foreign policy, I would have gone mad long ago.
I think one or two have accused you of having gone mad long ago, but that's a different matter altogether.
It's why I like newscasters. I really do. Thank you.
Paul Krugman, I suspect your take on Donald Trump is a little bit different from some other members of this panel, but I'd like you to reflect on Donald Trump and the world as opposed to your usual beat of economics. But the two are clearly related.
Yeah. When I looked at the title of the panel, which was something about interest versus...
Interests, not values, was... yeah.
And what struck me there and is that's actually a completely false dichotomy. The idea that America has been sacrificing itself, has been giving stuff away, whether on foreign policy or on economic policy, because of some pursuit of hippy-dippy values that we've been subsidizing the world, that we've been defending the world for free and letting them free ride on us on foreign policy, or the idea that we've been giving away the store on terms of trade policy, is utterly false. It's utterly, it's just not how things actually work. Certainly trade policy, where I know something about it, the point of international negotiations is almost always not to defend a national interest against, inter-country rivalry is actually trivial. It's almost always about internal struggles, and the real point of international trade negotiations is not to extract concessions from foreigners, but to defend yourself against your own special interests. And everybody who actually understands the field knows that. This is a fundamentally false dichotomy, which everybody knows except anybody in this administration or with any input into this administration. So we do have a bit of a problem, which is that the United States is now led by people who have a fundamentally false, and if I might say, just to lend a little nuance to a fundamentally false and quite stupid view about how the world works. That's upsetting. Now, there's a real question about how much it matters. There's a tremendous amount of inertia. The system that we built up, whether in national security, as Mr. Gates is pointing out, or on international trade, has a lot of built-in durability. I think we've seen a little bit. We don't know how things are going to work on NAFTA, but it's clear that confronted with the reality of what it would mean to actually abrogate that agreement, even Trump sort of backed off as the manufacturers troop in and say, do you realize how integrated North American manufacturing is right now? You rip it up, that's going to be totally destructive to our businesses. So, and I think there's something like that on many fronts. I don't think there's a real possibility that we'll reach the end of this tunnel and discover that very little actually happened. That U.S. foreign policy was not in any fundamental, real sense changed. That. Right. The world trading system survived. That's what I'm hoping.
Well, I guess that's a theme that's emerging, that actually, for all of the heat and light that we get from the president on Twitter and from his statements, that actually we shouldn't overestimate how much is really changing under the surface. But I think in this location particularly, we before I hand over to the audience for questions, we do need to just spend a little bit of time talking about the United States and Russia in the age of Trump. Now, I don't particularly want to get into the investigations currently preoccupying Washington, but I do want to get into what you guys see as happening to U.S.-Russia relations. Robert Gates, we know the president, wanted during the campaign to make noises warmer to Russia, to reach out to Putin. We also know that right now sanctions have just been ramped up and that Donald Trump had to sign a broader, expanded sanctions program, even though he made it plain he didn't want to. So what is happening? And given the title, Interests Not Values, to what extent is Trump driven by interests or values when it comes to his relationship with Russia and his policy on Ukraine?
Well, first of all, I agree that it's a false dichotomy. Every president that in modern times has pursued both our values and our interests with different levels of emphasis at different times. I think that when I introduced Tillerson to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, I said the challenge facing the administration was going to be how to push back against Putin's interventionism, not only in Ukraine, Crimea, and Eastern Europe and elsewhere, but intervention in political behavior, political activity in Europe, as well as in the United States. How to push back against that interventionism and general thuggery, and at the same time figure out a way to stop an increasingly dangerous downward spiral in the relationship. Frankly, I think it was a very serious mistake for the Congress to pass the legislation that they did on sanctions, because it eliminates, for all practical purposes, any prospect in the foreseeable future for those sanctions being adjusted or lifted. Because you're going to have to go back to the Congress, and the Congress taking a positive action to lift sanctions against Russia, particularly if Russia continues to occupy Crimea, makes it impossible. And so it gives the administration very little wiggle room in terms of trying to reduce the level of tensions with Russia. And then when you add to it the size of the Russian exercises going on the borders of Eastern Europe and so on, it continues to add the problems and the continued internal policies of Putin. So I think that the president has, I agree, I think he came into office wanting to improve the relationship with Russia. I think that the actions that Putin has taken and continued to take for the last number of years made that very problematical, and I think in many respects the president has reconciled himself to that reality, but I do think it was a mistake to codify these sanctions, because it means the prospect of improving that relationship is now removed to the very distant future.
Okay. Mr. Gingrich, I'd like your take on Russia right now and U.S. policy on it.
Okay, let me start, though. I want to go back to the comment you made to John about Angela Merkel. Look, the morning she gets through the election and she announces she's proposing a 300% increase in the German military budget, I'll take seriously that comment. But this notion, we Europeans now have to lead, fine, terrific. You could start by meeting your NATO obligations. We'd be thrilled. We're not threatened. I don't see anything except words, so I don't take it very seriously. Russia's a different problem, and one where, frankly, I think I was wrong. I underestimated dramatically Putin's ability to make it impossible to work with him. And I think this is really important to think about. I mean, the depth of anti-Russian feeling in the United States today may be almost as high as during the Cold War.
Is that largely because America, whatever Mr. Trump says, Americans buy the idea that the Russians tried very hard to meddle in and arguably pervert the U.S. presidential election process?
I think that's a part of it. And Trump hasn't denied that the Russians did stupid things. I mean, even Facebook has admitted that they were selling ads to a Russian company to try to, I mean, you know, but what's striking, first of all of us who've ever been involved in politics know the amount they were spending on the ads was an absurdity guaranteed to have no impact except to piss everybody off. But more deeply, it's the totality of Putin's behaviors, the totality of Putin's attitude. It's people getting assassinated. I mean, there's this general sense that this is a tremendously thuggish regime. It is stunningly dishonest. The whole invention of hybrid warfare is a model which they openly talk about. Here's the range of our rheostat. We can start with cyber war. We can go to propaganda. We can hire local. I mean, in Ukraine, you fully understand this. But when you start developing this as a model, I mean, our American military now teaches hybrid warfare as a way of understanding what the Russians are doing. Well, when you look at that stuff, what you say is, this guy is a threat. And so when people say, as Bob did, and I have enormous respect for Bob's background and all the different ways he served America, but I'm not very worried in the near future about offering Putin diplomatic niceties. I mean, this guy's got to make a profound decision at some point that the survival of his regime requires a fundamental change in their behavior, or we're just going to keep drifting towards more and more hostility. And the leverage is just going to keep going up. And I think this is a very serious problem, almost all of it created by Putin. And I do think, and at the time I was pretty tolerant of it, I think Trump was very sincere. I think Trump said, gee, I wonder if a new approach would work with Putin. Well, that lasted about 30 days, and frankly, Tillerson, who knows the Russians very well, Mattis, who knows them reasonably well, McMaster, who knows them reasonably well, you go down the list, all those guys ended up in the same place saying, you know, none of that stuff's going to work.
All right. One more from me to you, John. I don't want to stick on Russia because I think that's given us a great view of what's going on with regard to Russia policy. But you accused me earlier, quite legitimately, of lacking any sort of historical perspective. So in brief, John, before we open it up to the audience, I want you to address something that Bernard-Henri Lévy said earlier. I don't know if you were in to listen to it, but he basically said, you know, one of the big sort of geopolitical realities right now is the decline of the American empire. Do you buy that, or do you think that is just total hot air nonsense coming from Europe?
Well, I would never say anything so impolite as that. Look, the American empire is doing quite well, thank you, and I think the problem that we face with Russia today is, I believe, a nearly intractable set of conflicts that have largely been put in place by the Russians themselves. And I would not underestimate the future significance of the air base they established in Latakia in Syria, emblematic of their presence in that region, unequaled since the early and mid-1970s, before Anwar Sadat expelled the Soviet advisors from Egypt and turned Egypt into the Western orbit. I just think this is, it's not a circumstance where, even if you believed the allegations about collusion between the Trump campaign and the government of Russia to win the election, for which we are still waiting for a single bit of concrete evidence, it would nonetheless be impossible for a Trump administration to have turned the policies of the U.S. government in that direction, at least without provoking a revolution within the Republican Party. So I think this is another example where there's a lot of attention, really, and very little substance.
All right, I want to open it up now to questions from our audience. We've got a fantastic audience here of policymakers, thinkers, former prime ministers, all sorts of folk, and I'm sure there's some great questions on the floor. So raise hands if you've got a question, and we'll get a microphone to you, and we'll get it to our panel. So do not hold back. However attractive your lunch might look, please ask a question. We've got a hand up over there, so let's get a microphone to you, sir. Just bear with us, and we'll get some audio equipment to you. There you go. Name and question.
Thank you very much. Andrew Favorov. How does the panel assess the chances of, maybe on the global scale, emergence of a moderate centrist parties, especially maybe in the United States, despite the fact of the continuous polarization of the political environment? Do you think the moderates have a chance?
I'd like to fantasize about an American president who was willing to combine efforts to protect people with low incomes, people facing unfortunate circumstances with strongly market-oriented policies, willing to pursue policies that seem to make sense even if they came from the other opposite party, willing to adopt a flexible approach to foreign relations that showed strength when necessary. In other words, I'm talking about Barack Obama. If your vision is that the United States is torn apart by a hard left and a hard right party, you're living in a fantasy world, or you're a regular pundit who always have to create an equivalence between the sides, even where it doesn't. We have a moderate party, one it's called the Democratic Party. All of the radicalism is on one side. Look, I mean, we can talk foreign policy, whatever, but Obamacare, the signature of achievement, that's a Republican plan. It was devised at the Heritage Foundation. It was first implemented by a Republican by the name of Mitt Romney in Massachusetts. So don't talk about how we need to find the center. It's that we just lost the center. It doesn't require a new party to get there.
Robert,
I would ask which part of the Democratic Party Paul is referring to in that respect. I think that the prospects for a moderate centrist party emerging in Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and a variety of other places is virtually nil. The potential for moderate centrist parties arising and being elected in Europe and the United States, where there are moderates and centrists, and I think there are even some left in both of our political parties, I think is very real. I think part of the problem in the U.S. is that, and this is outside my bailiwick, but I think part of the problem in the United States is that both of our parties forgot about a lot of people in America who had been left behind by a lot of economic changes over which they had very little control, whether you call it trade or modern or globalization or the increasing use of the technology and robots and so on. But a lot of those people felt like nobody in Washington was paying attention to them.
But isn't it true to say that a lot of the politics of the United States at the moment is fueled by anger, insecurity and anger, and that perhaps isn't the most positive motivation for a political movement or a political philosophy?
I would argue that a lot of political activism is motivated by anger, one way or the other.
Yeah. It's perhaps a bleak view, may be right, but it's a little bleak. John, did you want to say something to this? Or?
Yeah, one reason Trump is president is the attitude Paul just demonstrated. We have a moderate party, and all the extremism is on the other side. So, Jeb Bush, an extremist? Marco Rubio, an extremist? If that's the way you want to think, you can see why we've got a polarization problem. I think the real irony here is, let me just finish the point, please, thank you. What really aggravates the Democrats is that Trump was able, politically, to do what Disraeli did to Gladstone in Britain in the 19th century. They had a saying that the liberals went bathing and Disraeli stole their clothes. And what he meant was he picked up a lot of working class votes. The reason Trump won is that he carried the white working class, the backbone of the Democratic Party historically, in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, and Wisconsin, destroying what the Democrats called the blue wall. And, my father was a firefighter for the city of Baltimore. Neither of my parents graduated from college. I know the white working class, and by God, I am happy that they're in the Republican Party.
All right, let's move on. Let's get more questions. We've got one over here, one over here. We'll start. If we've got a microphone, can we get to the... Yeah, we'll get one here, and then we'll come over there.
Well, thank you indeed. I'm a Liberal member of European Parliament. So, once being in Europe, could you offer your comments on future of Europe? Mr. Juncker just presented some scenarios, and we had a good debate in the European Parliament. So, do you see any special European scenario, political scenario for future would keep us with US as strategic partners?
Right, who wants to take that?
Let me say, first of all, as an example of this whole interesting dialogue about moderates, and I do want to say, Victor, I think that the opening video this morning was superb, and I hope it can be made available as a model. I mean, I thought the way they got you to think about it and to follow things was really, really well done. And I want to start with that. Because you had this up on the screen, that there was this huge danger of the populist Le Pen winning, and then it disappeared. And we got what? We got a centrist moderate, young, attractive, telegenic. And Macron currently is, I think, 9 points lower in approval than Trump. Because it turned out after they finished defeating Le Pen, they looked at what Macron stood for and they said, oh my God, you actually want to reform? We're talking longer work week, we're talking weaker union rules, we're talking easier firing of people. Are you crazy? We wouldn't have voted for you if we'd known you actually meant that stuff. So this whole notion of what does moderate mean and in what circumstance, the most successful politician in Europe today, who's about to get reelected comfortably, is sort of maybe a moderate, but it really is a maintainer. She's got a system that works. She tries not to screw it up. She has been enormously helped by Trump because she's been able to polarize in Germany against Trump. She's the woman tough enough to stand up to Trump. So the average German goes, I got it. It's Trump or it's Merkel. Okay, I'm for Merkel. She's going to win handily. She doesn't have any great program of reform because the system's working. And the truth is, they're not going to lead to very many reforms. I mean, the amazing thing to me, and I would have been wrong on this now for the last 5 or 6 years, I am stunned that they have sustained Greece. I mean, Greece is such a mathematically implausible project that the idea that they have managed to avoid serious reform and avoid solving the problems and just keep pumping enough money in to keep sort of stumbling along is the core of the European challenge. The whole Mediterranean is a much bigger problem. Northern Europe is not much of a problem. How you're going to solve that, I think, is fascinating. And I don't know that there's an answer to it.
And Robert Gates, just as a former US Defense Secretary, a man who went to NATO and actually delivered a very striking valedictory speech saying, you know what, you guys, if you don't cough up, if you don't meet your spending commitments that you've made to the NATO project, we in the United States are going to lose patience very, very quickly. What's your take on Europe and the United States today?
Well, what I said in Brussels in June of 2011 was that I was the last of the generation of policymakers at a senior level who had been through the Cold War and who had an emotional attachment to NATO, and that I would be followed not only in policymaking positions but in Congress and in the White House by people who didn't have that emotional connection and would begin to look at the alliance more as a cost-benefit analysis because of the disparity in terms of meeting defense obligations. Now, the truth of the matter is the Europeans have begun to tick up in their defense and security spending, not to the 2% level, but many of the countries have begun to increase those levels. But I would say that it was more due to the actions of Vladimir Putin and to ISIS than it was a sense of obligation to the alliance. And when you have countries also beginning to talk about a non-NATO military force, I've been hearing about the Franco-German brigade or division for 20 years, and somehow it just never happens. So I think that the point about the importance of Europe meeting its obligations remains important. The question is whether they will, the motive, frankly, is less important to me than them writing the checks for military capabilities. And I think one of the things that they could focus more on is collaboration on military systems. For example, there are half a dozen NATO countries that went in together to buy several C-17s because the countries couldn't afford them individually. That kind of collaboration makes a lot of sense in Europe. Unfortunately, there's not enough progress toward it.
All right, let's get more questions. Yeah, you, ma'am. Let's get your microphone.
Okay. So I'm not a lawmaker. I'm not a politician. and I'm not a thinker, but I am a student, and I am the future. If I wish to be a free world leader, and I have an American and a Russian passport, which one do I surrender?
Which one do you surrender? Well, here's your chance to be a father figure advisor.
Oh, look, I have faith, which means 80% probability that America will continue to be a free democracy. I think that's actually one thing that we have learned. I think Newt Gingrich thinks that liberals are in some state of terrible paralysis, and I will admit that election night was a bit of a shock, but I would say that the past 8 months have actually been, for someone like me, remarkably encouraging.
Hang on, I'm still wrestling with your figures. You're the mathematician economist, not me, but you're saying there's a 20% chance that America will cease to be a liberal democracy.
But you know, the truth was that prior to the election, it was probably 15%. You always have this imagination that current arrangements, that the good things will never go away, and there was always this didn't come out of nowhere. Those forces were already there, and the fact of the matter is that what we are discovering is that there's a depth of commitment among many, unfortunately not all, but many people in the United States to the country's ideals, and that will probably carry us through even this.
To the question, you're therefore saying you would not be sacrificing your U.S. passport.
No, and look, Russia has had a very, very hard time escaping from a very long legacy. Democracy never did sink roots in Russia.
Yeah, you know what? I'd fall off the stage if any of our panelists told me that they right now would be thinking of surrendering up their U.S. passport. But
no, I think following on your formulation, since we're obviously the past, our advice is not very useful. So I have a simple test for you. Go and spend 1 week in Moscow, and go spend 1 week in New York or Washington. You decide. You want to live in a country that's terrified, dominated by oligarchs, where people get assassinated, and where the media is controlled by the state? Keep your Russian passport. You want to live in a wide open country where you can become anybody, you could found giant companies? Keep the American passport. You decide which of those two futures do you want to gamble on.
Now look, at the risk of you lot laughing me out of court, I'm just going to quote to you something I read in the New Yorker magazine. Now I know what you're thinking. Some of you are thinking the New Yorker magazine, I don't give a whatever. But
cartoons.
But they did a poll of respected, and I use the word advisedly, respected American historians, and asked them, do you think there is a possibility, and it was admittedly in the week, I think, after the Charlottesville violence, is there a possibility, the way things are in the United States today, of another civil war in the United States? I don't know if any of you saw this, but the historians, when you looked at all of their different responses and their numerical percentages on a civil war, came back with the collective answer there was a 30% chance of an American civil war. Now, you don't have to take that too seriously, but the notion that America is more polarized, more divided than we have seen it for a very long time, that is surely a weakening factor for the United States, is it not?
Yeah, and that's, by the way, that is not conjectural. The polarization is visible. We can measure that. I mean, you can actually do a variety of things, and we are politically more polarized, certainly, than we were since the 1920s, and possibly since the 1850s. So that's real, and now I think it's kind of hard to see that turning. The logistics of a civil war are a lot harder in the modern world than they were then, but maybe, who knows? But no, the truth is and that, by the way, that would be true even if Hillary Clinton had won in November. We one way or another, we have to come to terms with that.
I think you better take historians' evaluation of contemporary events with many grains of salt. First of all, that's not their job. That's not what a historian does. And second, their short-term perspective is often very flawed. I remember many, many years ago one of these incessant polls about the best and worst U.S. presidents, and in the early 1950s, Harry Truman was regarded by almost all historians as truly one of the worst presidents in American history. So these short-term perspectives, I think, are pretty worthless. I also think that there's a shortage of perspective. I remember vividly 1974 and 1979 and 1980. We were a pretty polarized country then. we were a pretty polarized country in the early 1950s, in 1952, 53. So I think a little perspective and a grain of salt in order.
Yeah, well, I agree with grains of salt. That's true. I don't know if either of you wanted to go on that.
Let me just comment. I mean, I think part of what makes us a little difficult for much of the world to understand is that we are culturally a remarkably wide open country. It's something Tocqueville wrote about almost 200 years ago. And so we have all of our problems out in the open, and we argue out in the open, and we're pretty cheerful. In fact, some of us make a fair amount of money getting paid to argue out in the open. But that's the American model. I always remind everyone that the most significant recent Broadway play is Hamilton. Hamilton is this extraordinary musical that you couldn't invent. It took genius to create it. It's just a remarkable achievement. And it's about an American vice president killing an American secretary of the Treasury. Now, I can assure you, we have several secretaries of high office who are here today. We have not had that kind of difficulty inside the cabinet for 200 years.
Close a couple of times.
Yeah, Mr. Kerry's keeping his hands down at the moment. But let's take a couple more before we have to finish. By the way, I must congratulate you. You're eating so gracefully and quietly. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much. Or maybe it's just because you're enjoying the conversation. That's obviously what I hope. You, sir.
Thank you. My name is Giovanni Salvetti, and I work for Rothschild. I have a bit of a difficult question. From an American standpoint, how do you expect the situation between Russia and Ukraine to resolve, and within which time frame?
I think, well, I'm going to jump into this actually, I'm a historian by trade, so I'm going to ignore Bob's advice and leap right into analyzing the present. I think the Russians will eventually lose by exhaustion. I think they will lose because they have violated the norms so decisively, and a civilized world which tolerates them getting. Remember, we went after Saddam for stealing Kuwait. Now, Russia's obviously more dangerous than Iraq. There are a lot of other factors involved. But my sense is that the world is not likely to back off, and we're not likely to accept normalcy, and that Putin's personality makes it almost impossible for him to behave in a way that would allow us to have anything other than hostility. So my estimate is that you'll see more and more pressure building. You may see more waves of sanctions, and you may see, starting with defensive weapons here, a continued increase in pressure to raise the cost on him. I think he loses in eastern Ukraine first. He loses in Crimea later. But I think the notion this morning was right, that establishing a principle of next year in Yalta is exactly right, and a constant, unending reminder. And whether it's Putin or his successor, there will come a morning, I think, that a regime will seek a face-saving excuse to gradually make a transition, because it just gets too expensive. It ultimately becomes, for the average Russian, a stunningly irrational use of resources that doesn't achieve any kind of national greatness, doesn't achieve prosperity, and has them more and more isolated from the rest of the world. So it may take 3 to 5 years with eastern Ukraine. It may take a decade with Yalta, but I really do think there will come a moment that the Russian government will just decide, being this isolated, being this vilified, having this level of hostility is just not worth sustaining.
All right. I want to get more questions, and I only want to hear if there's a dissenting view on the panel from that. John?
Yeah, I'm decidedly more pessimistic. Unless there's a fundamental change in Russia, Putin has made it very clear what he's committed to. In his last State of the Union message in his earlier term as president, he said the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. So what that says is he wants to reestablish Russian hegemony within the space of the former Soviet Union, not to mention what he can get in Eastern and Central Europe. And so I think this is something that, whatever the cost, he has to continue. He continues it because not only does it provide him domestic political benefits, he believes it. And actually, sometimes in politics, people act on what they believe. The question is whether the response of the West will be strong enough, and so far it's not been strong enough. Certainly was not strong enough in the prior administration, and I don't think we know what the answer in the Trump administration will be, but I think now we're going to see some testing. I think this exercise next door in Belarus is a kind of testing. I don't think we know the outcome, but I don't think Putin is pulling away.
I would agree with John in that respect. I think it is going to take time. I think it's going to be very tough. But in a way, I also agree with Newt in that I think Putin has fallen into the Soviet trap. He is pursuing a military modernization on the basis of a very weak and declining economy. And the more he spends on military bases in Syria, the more he spends on large exercises in Western Russia, the more he spends on modernizing their systems, the worse economic conditions are going to become inside Russia itself. So over time, I believe those pressures will begin to be felt just as they were in the Soviet Union. He's fallen right into the same trap.
Okay, we've got time for one more. So let's, if we can we get a microphone to the back? Because there's been a very patient hand up at the back there. Can we get a mic over there? To the gentleman who's standing up. Is that possible? At the back. Wave your hand, sir. Wave it vigorously so they can see you. There you go. Right, so one more pithy question, please.
Hello, my name is James Miller from The Interpreter. And it strikes me Mr. Gingrich mentioned hybrid warfare, that we are under attack by hybrid warfare, whether it be cyber attacks, election interfering, actual warfare, annexation in Crimea, et cetera, et cetera. It's both happening in Ukraine, it's happening in France, it's happening in Germany, Poland. Estonia had an agent kidnapped across the border. Although I am a little bit stunned that somehow this is news to the Speaker of the House, that I guess it happened only within the last year. But my question is this. We are under attack. We are not attacking back. All of the measures that have been taken are defensive. When you look at this ransomware attacks that are coming from Russia, these are offensive attacks. How do we defend against this, and do we take offensive action, whether it be counter-hacking or something? Perhaps you have ideas what an offensive action would look like.
Is it time for the U.S. to play offense?
Well, I think it's more than the U.S. I think it's the entire European community as well. I mean, as you just mentioned, you have activities in France, you have activities in Germany. You certainly had people being killed in London. There's a good. You had the assault several years ago on Estonia. Look, I may be being overly influenced because I've been going through a series of books on the late 30s and the first phase of World War II. But I do believe that one of the keys that happens is the democracies gradually talk to themselves, and when they can't avoid it, they decide they have a real enemy. They don't want to have a real enemy. It doesn't fit how democracies work. But sometimes they decide they do. And when they do, they have enormous capacity to mobilize and enormous capacity to exact pain. And the reason I'm slightly more optimistic, I think, than John is, and John is certainly extraordinarily knowledgeable, and I agree with his definition of Putin's aims, I believe there is an emerging consensus that will grow and consolidate, and that Putin will consistently teach is accurate, that this is an enemy, this is not just a neighbor with a bad opinion, this is an enemy, that the doctrine they're following is the doctrine of an enemy, and that we have to overmatch them, and we have to make it so expensive that they cannot sustain these kind of policies. And I think this administration, in that sense, may be peculiarly dangerous for Putin because, first of all, the quality of the people that Trump has surrounded himself with military background and military experience, if they start designing plans of being offensive, to use your term, they're going to be pretty aggressive. And Trump himself is a naturally aggressive person. I mean, if he reaches a conclusion that we have to find a way to dramatically shrink Putin's choices, he is likely to take far more risks than most American politicians would take.
All right. John?
Yeah, and just to follow on to that, the key question, I think, is whether Trump in the near future will authorize lethal military assistance to Ukraine, which I would have done years ago. The next question is whether any significant European country will do the same. And my guess is that's where it starts to come off the track. Because even if the United States says we will provide lethal military assistance, I'd be very surprised if it's supported by the Europeans. I'd be delighted, but very surprised.
Okay. I have to wrap in a second. I'm just going to go down the panel and ask each of you one last question, which I suspect some members of the panel might be quite irritated by, but I think it exercises some of us around the world. And the question is this. We know that Robert Mueller is continuing his investigation. It looks like he's ramped it up. It looks like it's a serious investigation. There are people in the United States, admittedly most of them political opponents of Donald Trump, who predict that he will not last a full 4-year term. People looking in at the United States from overseas have to wonder, is this a president who is going to survive and fill a full 4-year term? I just want each of you to give me your assessment of whether there's any realistic possibility that the Trump presidency will end before the 4-year term.
Yes. I mean, I have no idea about collusion and all of that. No more than anyone who reads a lot of news media might have. But a lot of stuff comes up. You know, when you start bashing open closet doors, you find a lot of skeletons involving corrupt financial dealings. And my God, we haven't brought that up at all. But if there's one thing we do know about this president, it is that he has come in with a degree of financial compromise, a financially compromised position. The conflicts of interest have never been, we've never seen anything like this in the United States before. And in the end, I think there's a very good chance that this will bring him down one way or another.
Robert Gates?
Well, without any inside knowledge at all of Mueller's investigation, I think the odds are very high he will complete his 4-year term.
Newt?
I mean, I hate to disappoint Paul, but I think he actually will serve 8 years.
8 years, okay. Well, thank you for that. John?
Yeah, look, I've spent 30 years opposing the concept of independent counsels. I think they're fundamentally anti-democratic, and their history is that it's a rare independent counsel that doesn't indict somebody for something. So people around Trump will go down, possibly for financial misdeeds, but I don't see anything yet. And if any of Trump's political opponents had it, they would have leaked it by now. I don't see anything yet that comes close to impeachable. And so I think the odds of Trump lasting in office are just about as high as they can be.
All right. Well, panel, I do thank you very much indeed for a really fascinating discussion. Thank you so much to John Bolton, to Newt Gingrich, to Bob Gates, and to Paul Krugman. Ladies and gentlemen, I was told to talk till the pudding. The pudding is served, so please enjoy, and thank you, panel. Thank you very much.